Story 1. After a long and exhausting day at work, I had to work overtime until around 8 p.m. It was also the weekend and my boss's birthday, so the whole team decided to go out for a celebration dinner. After we finished eating, it was already past 10 p.m., and since my house was far away, I asked if I could leave early. However, my boss suggested that I join my colleagues for some more fun. It was hard for me to refuse, so I agreed and we all headed to a bar. By the time I left, it was already past 11 p.m. On my way back, the night scenery became quieter, with only dim yellow street lights shining down the road. Occasionally, cars would speed by in the night, and a few raindrops started falling, making the cold air even chillier. At that moment, I had left the city and the road home became emptier. I reached the beginning of the embankment, where the wind blew stronger and the rain became heavier. I decided to park my car near an empty house on the embankment to seek shelter from the rain. I took out a cigarette from my pocket and lit it to keep warm. After finishing the cigarette, I put on a raincoat from my backpack and was in the process of putting on rain pants when I heard a noise from the corner of the house. I startled and accidentally stepped on a fallen brick, causing me pain and shock that rendered me speechless. My heart was pounding, and despite it being winter, I was sweating from fear. I realized there was someone sitting huddled in the corner of the house. I wondered whether it was a real person or a ghost, and why I didn't see anyone when I initially arrived. These questions kept racing through my mind. Lost in thought, I regained my composure, my hands trembling, but I bravely took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I realized that person was a girl, with a frightened expression, sitting and hugging her knees, shivering from the cold. Knowing for sure that it was a person, I felt more at ease compared to before. I smiled softly and asked, "Hello. What are you doing here at this hour?" The girl nervously replied, "Hello. I was waiting for the bus here, but it started raining heavily. I went inside there to take shelter from the rain and ended up falling asleep. I only woke up when you arrived, and I was too afraid to speak, thinking I might encounter a bad person." I gently smiled and said, "Do I look like a bad person to you?" The girl startled and stood up to talk to me. We started chatting, and I learned her name was H, a final year college student. She had come to visit a friend's house and planned to take the bus back home. Fortunately, H's house was in the same direction as mine, so I decided to give her a ride. I lent her my raincoat to keep warm, and then we set off together. Due to the cold weather, neither of us spoke much during the journey. When we reached H's house, the weather had eased up, and the rain had stopped. I found it peculiar that the lights were still on inside H's house, even though it was past midnight. I wondered if something special was happening inside. I intended to ask H about it, but when I turned around, she was nowhere to be seen. Only the neatly folded raincoat remained in the car. I assumed H must have entered the house through the back gate, as the main gate was locked. I felt strange that H didn't thank me before entering the house. As I turned the car around to leave, H's dog suddenly rushed out from the house and started barking continuously. Startled and frightened, I almost crashed the car into the wall. In my panic, a man emerged from inside H's house, presumably her father. The man shouted loudly, causing the dog to retreat and stop barking, but it still stared at the gate and growled. The man opened the gate and asked me wearily, "Who are you? What brings you here?" I replied urgently, "I'm the one who gave H a ride home after she took shelter from the rain. And H went inside the house, so I asked to leave first to avoid being late." The man sighed sadly and said, "I'm H's father. You've come inside and have a cup of water." I followed and entered the house with H's father. As soon as I passed the gate, a woman's voice spoke. "Who came to the house so late?" That was H's mother. I greeted H's mother. "Hello, Aunt," H's father said. "This young man brought my daughter home. I invited him in for some water." We sat down, and inside the house, I sensed the overwhelming smell of incense. Perhaps it was a memorial ceremony. H's father poured water for me inside, taking a sip himself. Then, he walked to the altar and lit an incense stick. I also stood up and looked at the altar. When I looked at H's photograph, a girl who hitchhiked in my car, I was shocked and horrified. The photo clearly stated H's name, birth year 1994, and death year 2015. I felt goosebumps rise on my skin, and I looked at H's father with astonishment. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. H's father sighed deeply and prepared to say something, but at that moment, H's mother, who had been crying downstairs, came up and said, "That's my daughter. She passed away today. It's been 49 days. At this point, I became confused and didn't know what to say. Why was it like this? H had just hitchhiked in my car, So why was it like this? Could H be a ghostly spirit? I was in a state of confusion when I heard the story continue. H was the only daughter, very intelligent and obedient. Her parents had worked hard to provide her with better educational opportunities and a brighter future. But during H's time in school, she fell in love with a man from the city. H and that man were in love for 3 years, but then he left H to be with his boss's daughter. H felt desperate and ended her life by jumping into the river. The spot where H jumped was only about 100 meters away from where I encountered her. I asked for permission to leave, and on the way back, I couldn't help but think about H's image, which frightened me. As I passed each streetlight, I suddenly startled when I saw the shadow of a girl sitting behind my car. It was H's shadow. But when I turned around, there was no one there. A feeling of horror spread through me. Looking in the mirror, I was terrified once again when I saw the image in the mirror, disheveled hair and glowing red eyes staring at me. I trembled and shook my hand to avoid seeing that terrifying image again. When I arrived home, my fear still couldn't be concealed. When I opened the gate and entered, my cat rushed over and scratched the car. I closed the gate to enter the house, and at that moment, the dog inside suddenly jumped up and barked in horror. I turned around and saw that it was H. Story 2. I was driving my truck to deliver stones to a customer along the Dyke Road when a strange incident occurred. At that moment, I saw a young man, looking about 30 years old, bathing in the lake. He waved his hand, asking for a ride on my truck. Despite being soaked, I didn't hesitate to let him hop on. We drove for about 2 kilometers, but he didn't say a word. When I turned back to ask him where he was going, his face was covered in blood, and he grinned at me with bared teeth. I was terrified, slammed on the brakes, and abandoned the truck to seek help. However, when people arrived, there was no one there. When I looked at the passenger seat, it was still wet, but no one was sitting on it. But the story didn't end there. After returning home, I fell ill and was bedridden for a whole month. I went from one hospital to another for treatment, but there was no cure. The doctors simply attributed it to sunstroke, as it was scorching hot that day. After 3 days without any improvement, my mother felt that something was amiss and decided to seek the help of a spiritual healer. My mother found a renowned spiritual healer and asked for his assistance. The healer placed his finger on my forehead and remained silent for a while. Then he said, "Your son is being possessed by a demonic spirit." My mother was terrified and asked what should be done. The healer instructed my mother to prepare some ceremonial items and a few pieces of clothing, as the spirit was once a soldier in the military and required those things. That night, starting from 5 p.m., my mother stayed at home to watch over the house while my wife took care of me. Around midnight, at about 1 a.m., my wife got up to use the bathroom. As she entered the restroom and was about to sit down, she heard the sound of running water from beside the restroom and then heard someone walking out from inside. Drip, drip. My wife silently pondered, why would someone walk barefoot in the restroom? She had a vague thought while the sound of footsteps paused outside my sister's room. My wife furrowed her brows and looked down at the gap under the door, seeing someone's foot facing toward my sister's room. The foot was pale, which made my wife suspicious. Her heart started pounding, and her breathing became heavy. Everything around her seemed to slow down to the point where she could hear her own heartbeat. Thud, 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 thud. Suddenly, the person outside bent down and quickly peered through the gap, looking at my wife with a face covered in blood. At that moment, my wife could only shut her eyes tightly and let out a scream. When she opened her eyes, there was nothing there. She stared intently at the floor beneath the door for a while, not seeing anything new. Trembling, she pulled up her pants and cautiously opened the door to run outside. The next morning, exactly at 9 a.m., my mother took the ceremonial items to the healer's house for a ritual. The healer summoned the spirit and asked why it wanted to harm my wife. The spirit simply said it didn't want to harm her, it was just teasing her because she was so beautiful. Smiles. After offering the spirit its share of the ritual meal and burning the clothing, my mother brought me back home. The next day, I recovered and returned to normal health, but since then, I dared not drive my truck through that road again. Story 3. On that day, I had to run at night and enter a very deserted road, a desolate country road. The dim streetlights mixed with the sounds of frogs, geckos, and other strange noises, creating a noisy yet incredibly quiet space. Gentle gusts of wind rustled through the tree branches, giving me a shivering sensation. I had been running for a while when suddenly, a very beautiful girl appeared by the roadside, wearing a pristine white outfit. In my mind, I tried to appear normal, but deep down, I felt a bit uneasy. Encountering a girl standing by the road on such a dark night made me think that she might be a ghost. However, I decided to continue running. As I ran past her, the girl suddenly shouted, startling me. Her voice sounded like it came from a distant world, trembling and echoing. Although I was a bit scared, when I looked closely at her face, she appeared very beautiful and seemed like an ordinary person. She happily stepped forward, thanked me, and said that she needed a ride to a nearby town. During that stretch of road, she didn't say a word. After about 30 minutes, my mind seemed to drift into a dream, but I could still see the road. I turned around to ask her the destination, but to my surprise, she was nowhere to be found. Panic started to consume me, my heart pounding and fear overwhelming me. I thought I had encountered a ghost, but it didn't stop there. I decided to look into the rearview mirror to see if she had climbed into the back. With that thought in mind, I realized that the car was still moving, and no one could have climbed in from behind. However, I still tried to look into the mirror, and to my shock, I saw a different face, like a demon with a bloodied, wrinkled, and distorted face. My state of mind became frantic, and I was overwhelmed to the point of fainting. When I regained consciousness after 15 minutes, I mustered up courage and looked into the mirror again. But there was no trace of that demon. I breathed a sigh of relief and tried to focus to continue running. However, I realized that the car was moving as slow as a snail on sand. Gradually, we approached the town, and the lights of the houses ahead became clear, bringing me a sense of relief and joy. At that moment, I noticed an old woman carrying goods walking in the same direction as me towards the town. Since it was close to dawn and I was nearing residential areas, I didn't feel surprised anymore. However, once again, I heard a sentence that sent shivers down my spine from the old woman carrying goods. Is it like this? I turned back to look, and the world spun as I realized that the old woman's face was the face of the girl I had encountered before, the one with a demonic, bloodied, and completely disfigured face. With nothing more to say, at 4 a.m., I screamed like a child about to be vaccinated. When I arrived in town, I stopped the car and cried like rain. Although it seemed strange for a man to cry, the townspeople heard my cry and rushed out to ask me. I told them that I had seen it twice, and everyone nodded, indicating that it was normal. Everyone passing by would see it. With a pounding heart, I decided to leave the town and not drive for a month. Gradually, I regained my composure and courage to continue my work.